Welcome to YouX, the global podcast at the intersection of research, design, and development. Sit back and listen as your hosts explore the ever-evolving world of user experience. And now, Chris Covell and Mustafa Ahmed.
Welcome to YouX. Mustafa, how are you doing?
Good. How are you, Chris?
Doing fine. This is show number 2. And I know that the theme of today's show is going to be teams. Broad theme, but that should be good for us to get us into certain topics and certain discussion points. But I wanted to go back to some of the topics, or at least one topic in particular, that came up on our first show, which was defining and kind of understanding what UX is, answering the question what UX is. And I wanted to kind of start off there and get your opinion on some thoughts that I had kind of, in between last show and this show. And hopefully that can maybe lead into some of the topics that we talk about today regarding teams. But how is UX any different than what business people or product people are doing on a day-to-day? And I think that the answer might be two major points, I guess you can say, which would be one, I would say empiricism, looking and using methods to understand the actual users, whether that's a survey, whether that's a usability study, whether that's a contextual inquiry. But it's having those user-centered metrics, almost like a social scientist would, to collect the data on users, then use that data to set strategy, impact design, this kind of thing. And then I think the other one I would say is big picture thinking. And what I mean by big picture thinking is, experiences kind of tread, and we kind of got into this topic last time, tread across many different products and services, right? And if you're a product person, you're pretty laser focused on your product and what people are doing with it and how it's affecting the bottom line and how it's integrating with the rest of the business strategy. But I think user-centered designers in particular kind of take a step back and look at journeys from the user point of view, whether that is one product or whether that's a omni-channel. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Yeah, I do agree with you. But when it comes to what UX is, and from the part of the world that I'm sitting in, I feel like that you have to take one step back and answer a more fundamental question that we often get challenged with. And that there's this general misconception, and this is just purely speaking from my experiences now, that people tend to have, when interacting with business stakeholders and technology folks. They all think UX folks are just designers, are guys and girls who are going to jump into Figma and craft out of some screen based on some rudimentary business requirements doc.
And I think it's important to also just interject and say that it's not only, I agree, I think they think that they're designers, but I think that they think that they're just digital designers too.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's another aspect too, is that people tend to, I think, conflate UX with just being digital first or digital focused. I mean, I think that digital first might be what we are, but I would imagine that the UX people can also work on other things which are not purely apps or websites.
We can go across the wide spectrum of online and offline channels,
right?
But the challenge I seem to face, and at least I did when I first started this recent gig, was trying to get people to understand that UX guys are not just people who are going to sit and work on Figma. We don't consume requirements off of a BRD or half-baked user stories and just translate that into screens, right? There's a lot more thinking about it. There's a lot more strategy to it. We have to think about the customer, because everything we get from our stakeholders that we work with are thinking about the P&L, the bottom line, the tech feasibility. Nobody's really thinking about the customer until we step into the picture. And that's something that people need, or we need to be able to explain and storytell and evangelize the right way before we can actually get things rolling.
Playing devil's advocate, though, you would think that a product person who owns a specific, not experience maybe, but owns a specific set of technologies would be thinking about their end users. And they would be, because, you hear a lot of times our superpower in UX is empathy. And we can maybe get into this too. I have I think, possibly controversial views on empathy, because I think it sometimes gets, again, conflated with sympathy, which I'm not a fan of thinking of it that way. And we talk about, okay, well, our superpower or what we bring to the table from a UX point of view is empathy with our users. But I mean, can't an engineer have empathy for their users? Can't a product person have empathy with the users? And my argument is that they probably do, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what else would you say that, thinking about the value of UX, what do we do different in a sense than a product person? I mean, I partly kind of got at that question, which I say big picture thinking. It's not product focus, it's experience focus, which can mean that many different kinds of touch points come into focus and come into view. Like, pretty much, I'm biased here because I am, you as well. We're researchers, so we collect data on customers and you translate that into design requirements or helping business create strategies with these kind of data inputs, and which is empiricism. I mean, I don't know any product managers or product owners who I've interacted with in my experience who know how to run, a really great usability study or know how to, using recruiting tools and this kind of thing. I would say those are the two. But I mean, how else would you kind of define or explain or describe the value that a UX person brings to a business team?
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it is, right, that, and you brushed upon this earlier, that empathizing is kind of the more fundamental core thing that we bring to the table. But you are right. Business folk, engineers, they all can empathize, right? There are things that are kind of borrowed and shared across and can be taught and learned in terms of, practices and behaviors across these different domains of business, technology, and design. What we as UXers kind of really bring to the table is that we are the specialists in this, right? The others may learn to empathize, but they'll never be a specialist to be able to action on it unless that skill is practiced and perfected over a period of time, through projects. But yeah, so I mean, the whole idea of kind of giving the name to this podcast as UX and really playing a play on the word of U and X was to focus on the customer, focus on the user, right? I mean, a lot of folks in my circle who've, and a big shout out to all those that tuned in on the first episode, are folks who are in the business space, are folks who are in the technology space. And we want to really push that message that UX is not just about the aesthetics. It's not just about design. It's not just about making things look pretty. It's about how do you make things simple, right? How do you make it easy?
Yeah. Or I would even add to that by saying, how do you make things functional, truly functional, because to me, defining out and finding customer problems, areas of pain, and then augmenting and smoothing experience makes the technology that you're building more functional. I think simple is a good way of kind of coming at it too, because usually simple is better, but it's not, I would argue that it's not always the case that simple is better. Maybe you want to make something that is kind of complex. My example I usually use here is with Adobe. Like, I don't know if anybody who is a professional photo editor would want Adobe to be more simple. They kind of have that with Lightroom, right? But Photoshop is a kind of a beast, but it's very functional. The function, you can do a lot with it. It is. I don't know if you would classify it as simple. But it's certainly well designed, organized, or orderly, or low entropy. Low entropy design is a term that I sometimes use, which is not so much simple design, and simple sometimes can be good, but it's organized design.
Yeah, but let me play a bit of a devil's advocate there. What isn't the whole purpose or the whole goal? And just to go along with your Photoshop example, the whole goal for this, to create something, right? You're trying to, maybe let's say it's a poster for a brand spanking new podcast that you've got going on. And that's the goal, right? You just want to create a poster, and however, yes, there might be a number of different functions and capabilities and features that you can use to do all sorts of things and really express your creativity. But the bottom line is you're just trying to create a poster.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that smoothing experience is important. But I do think that is a kind of downstream issue. When you're actually upstream trying to create functional product, services, technology, I think the usefulness of what you're actually creating becomes precedent. And usefulness to me is that it solves a problem. It helps you do something. It benefits your life in some way. Mm-hmm. As a user of this thing that you're interacting with. I think I'm trying to get the quote right. I think it's Chopin who talks about the final step is simplicity. And I think that that's probably true, that you really do want to take the functional thing, the useful thing that you're seeking to create, and then make sure that it's as smooth and as easy to use as possible, for sure. And that's no small task. Going back to you said something interesting, I think, about a poster. If you want to create a poster, and it actually goes, I think, back to another thing you were talking about, that like designers designers are not really. That's why I sometimes refer myself as a product designer, not just a designer, because you hear design, I think people immediately think aesthetics. I think they immediately think like interior decorating. That's like certain connotations like that, or even architecture, which I think is actually a better analogy to or closer to what we do than say graphic designer. But yeah, I think most people think when you hear design as aesthetic, color palettes, fonts, shapes and sizes, and this kind of thing. Which is why I try to make the distinction kind of aesthetic and functional. Functional mm-hmm. is what the thing does, how it helps you, whereas the aesthetic is how it looks. But yeah, poster to me, I mean, I on some level I could define it as a product. But it is kind of in between, as yes, it has this function. Whereas, for example, the poster, let's say it's a music poster and it's advertising some concert that's coming up on campus in 2 weeks. That's the function. It's communicating that to people who are walking by, and it needs to function in that aspect. But it's also highly artistic too, because the poster itself has to be put together by an artist. It's not a product designer who's putting together a poster. It's an artist, probably using Illustrator or some tool to throw together a bunch of designs to make it appealing and aesthetically compelling. So to some degree, it isn't really a functional product. The function to me is its ability to convey information.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. I mean, poster is a bit more of a lightweight kind of example to take here. But, I think at the same time, there is a function, there is a purpose, there is something going on. It's delivering a message. And, you could have, you can really take a step back and look at a much more larger or a bigger kind of picture to this, that if the goal is to inform users that, hey, there's this event coming up, you should come down, then it's more than just, what goes on the poster, but also where the poster lives, right? And then now we're talking about the ecosystem, the wider ecosystem, and how your users really interact and get that message.
Right, where it lives, even things like how high it is. Is it at eye level? I mean, there's all this research done in the past about how placing products on the shelf of a supermarket and how it increases or decreases sales just by where it's placed, independent of the way it looks, which is kind of interesting, right? But yeah, I mean, I think you're right. And you can even take that poster example and translate it into the business of at the end of the day, you want to spend money on the poster. You want to make it good because there's a return. There's the ultimate return is that you're going to have your concert that you put on in 2 weeks will be sold out. If you have no posters, then the word is it's poster might be kind of an antiquated example here because you're probably going to put it on social media or online or something. But still, I mean, I think posters still serve a purpose, and the purpose you got to look at it. I think looking at it from a business angle, you can still find that business piece to it, which is, you're going to sell more tickets if people know about it, right?
No, absolutely. And I mean, just trying to now wrap this crazy analogy back to the theme of the show, teams, right? How do we structure teams? How do we get the job done? And I think maybe let's piggyback off of the poster example and kind of go about what would be the team structure here, right? What is a bare bone teams that you would need to successfully get people to tune into your show? Let's start small with a poster.
I mean, I think structuring the teams and the question about who's on teams and is really an interesting run, and one that there might not be one exact answer, right? It might be very context specific, but I think that we should start thinking also about principles and about standards, because that's actually hopefully going to be a theme, at least from my end. It's going to be kind of a hobby horse that I'm going to probably ride in the coming shows, which is kind of a call for more standards and practices, and to really make UX and design thinking a kind of institution that a constitution of specific knowledge that can be disseminated and we can agree and disagree on, or we can seek to change or seek to adapt and move for push forward.
So sort of like an operating model for research and design teams.
Yeah, I mean, operating model for UX, because I think it's so new and it's a bit immature right now. And I think what we have to do as everybody in the community has to do, I think, is come together and begin to build this out and to begin to get some standards and practices and disseminate them and argue about them and debate it and kind of agree on certain standards and certain institutions and norms, because I think that that's the real defining feature of a kind of mature discipline. For example, my girlfriend is a dentist, and they have conferences and that you can go and get degrees and you can get certifications. There are scientific papers being written and knowledge being created, and it's a community. It's a knowledge-based community, and I think I'd like to see the same thing for UX or for design, product design, as kind of some of the more robust, let's say, or mature reality science-based communities, for example, like law or dentistry or medicine or something like that. So hopefully we'll keep talking about this, but I think the one of the aspects of that, that organization and institution that needs to be kind of the foundation that needs to be laid, which is team structure and roles and responsibilities. I think that's huge, right?
Yeah. I think let's start small. Let's kind of look at it as, if there's how have, I mean, now we've seen these kind of team structure go all the way and as big as, innovation labs and, with multidisciplinary folks looking after so many different aspects of a user experience and even tapping into technology. But if we had to kind of start from the very beginnings, what would be sort of like a bare bones structure kind of team that you look for?
Yeah, it's such a good question, right? One of the things that puts me in a kind of an interesting position here, because I've been involved in, I guess you can call it UX or human factors, technology development for about 10 years. And I've been on a lot of different teams that kind of do it different ways. I think we first need to determine kind of agency, what I call an agency model or a embedded model, right? There are teams that I've been on which are in the actual organization, part of the organization, but operate as an agency model, which is a kind of separation from the business. And the business comes to the UX team or the research team with specific asks, and there's a back and forth that goes on, and you kind of deliver the work to them as a client almost, or as a stakeholder. Then it's usually one-offs. Sometimes you can have multiple projects kind of in bigger macro project, but then there's a different model where you actually embed individuals on your team onto product teams, or you kind of give a product manager, a researcher, a designer, and then they kind of stay on that product team, I think, for a long term. They're embedded six months, a year, maybe even longer. So I think that there's a distinction there to kind of talk through first, like what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. Then we can also talk about the different roles within a given design team. I mean, I think just really the current structure of the design team or the UX team that I'm on has 3 pillars, which I kind of like. And I think it makes sense to have these 3 pillars, which is design, research, and actually data science. So,
interesting.
You can also probably add other things, like content people, I would say, and administrators. But I think that as of right now, I like having those 3 as the main pillars. I mean, I think it assumes also that you have enough, data, enough telemetry data running in the background so that data science people can, have data to wrangle and analyze. But I think with most big companies, probably that infrastructure is already in place. So,
no, I think that's an interesting take to that. Research, design, and data analyst, I guess, pillars, like you put it.
Yeah,
that's interesting. I mean, from my experience, the way I've kind of looked at it. So I guess let me start with the 2 kind of different operating models that you talked about, right? The embedded versus the agency style. So I've been a part of, I guess you could say, both. I've seen and observed both. There are definitely pros and cons to each. From my experience, the way I kind of I've tried to develop more of a hybrid approach to that, where you get the benefits of embedding someone into a project. So you effectively, at the end of that project, that designer or that squad of the research and design component becomes more of product experts, right? Subject matter experts when it comes to that kind of field, because whatever project they may be working on, maybe, I'll just take banking as an example, right? Considering that's an industry that you and I both from, the payments and transfers, right? Maybe they're part of the payments and transfers team. So by the end of the project, you'd imagine they become subject matter experts. They understand how things work. They've got a better understanding on, the business side of things. They know the technology limitations and constraints and how to work around that. But then at the same time, if they were fully embedded and completely lost touch with the base, then there's a question of quality control, right? How do you make sure things are passing through quality control checks? How do you make sure things are communicated and story told the right way, right? Because the only time I personally would feel comfortable leaving a designer with a product team full time is if they were multidisciplinary, right? Can they cover all aspects?
Are you saying, and let me run that back real quick. I mean, are you saying that embedded, because I agree. I think there are pros and cons with each, and I know that it seems like in this day and age that, and this could be off, but it just from the people I've talked to in the industry, it seems like embedded model or is the model that people tend to want to, aspire to. That like they'll say, UX people, design people in industry will say, our design team is mature because we're embedding people onto projects and they're achieving results. I'm not sure if that's necessarily true, but you're saying that the quality control point, you're saying that if you embed, let's just say, a designer onto a specific service line or with the product team, that they can then become biased and they don't see the product with fresh eyes? Or is that not what you're saying?
No, I wouldn't say necessarily the bias aspect. I kind of play more on the fact as a strength, right? They get a better, clear understanding of, because you have to understand this, right? At the end of the day, we're designers, we're creatives, we're UXers, right? We're not product guys, we're not business folk. There's no expectation to be. But if you do have a designer that really understands business and tech, is specific to that domain that they're working in, that's a massive advantage that they've got, right? That they collaborate better with the folks they're working with. They're able to really pull together and tell the story of the challenge that that they had to deal with and how they overcame it through design and research. Like, those are all plus points, right? So that's kind of a massive positive I see with Merit.
Yeah. What would you say the negative, though? Because I can see a few negatives with embedding.
Yeah. So embedding long term, right? 6 months to 12 months, like you mentioned earlier. There is, first of all, there's going to be I would have paranoia. Let's put it that way. Some good paranoia about the fact that, how things are going. Are they getting fully consumed? Can they fight their own fight? Are they able to tell the story of what we're doing? Are they able to reflect? Because at the end of the day, they're representing the team, right? They're representing the research and design team.
How do we tell a story about how this designer, how this researcher has made an impact on this project? That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah, because when I think agency model, and correct me here if I'm wrong, I think of it as a team working together on addressing a problem and kind of dealing with it in to a certain extent isolation away from the business, and maybe tapping in and checking in from time to time. But they have their freedom, they have their flexibility to kind of produce the best work they want to produce without having too much of a influence or pressure set from the business, right? Because when I think embedded, and I'm kind of referring to not the most mature kind of organizations, I'm thinking a designer sitting and working, and you got business stakeholders all around them telling them, move the cursor here, put this there, put this text there, change this box, add that shadow. That's what I'm kind of envisioning.
When I say embedded, I've worked embedded before. It's a project being led by a business person, for example, a product owner. The product owner is the kind of conductor, right? And they have creatives, they have content people, they have other technology folks, but they're the one who's setting agenda, setting strategy, building out the roadmaps. When I say agency, I mean product owners, stakeholders coming to, not necessarily having a researcher or having a designer or having a data science person, but coming to the UX department, which is separate, and scoping out a piece of work, having them deliver on it. For example, I come from, as you know, I come from a very research-centered point of view. So and the model that we ran at the bank was very, I would call it agency, because we would have these kind of scoping meetings with leaders, whether it could be a marketing person or a product owner or a change management individual. They would come with a problem, something they would want research on. And I think research might even fit agency a little bit better than maybe UX in general. That could actually be an interesting topic. But as I was running the research lab, as you know, we would scope it out. We would get really tight on what we were doing. We would deliver it. We would pick the methods. We'd bring them involved. We would involve them if they wanted to be involved. But if they did, a lot of times they didn't want to be involved. Right? They were just like, we like this scope. We want to see your results. We're interested in it, but just in 2 or 3 weeks, tell us when delivery is.
Yeah,
that would happen, and then we wouldn't see them again until they had another problem. Whereas embedded, it would be much different. It would be a long-term engagement where you as a researcher would be on a team, fighting for your insights to become impactful. So I've seen a lot of problems happen with embedded models just because, and a lot of it I think has to do with roles not being properly defined, people not knowing what UX is, not knowing how research operates, also having this kind of sense of, not so much animosity between research and design and product, but like creating kind of us versus them. Whereas you as a researcher are kind of coming with your findings, making recommendations, and the people who have to consume it, who are your teammates, and who you've been with, for many months, don't want to take it forward because of bad incentives, because of timelines, deadlines. So it can become frustrating, I think, if you're a researcher or a UX person or a designer, that your ideas don't get taken forward, or that you kind of are sitting there, and you're not sure how to be best in how to make the most impact. And there have been times too when I've been on teams when, for a few months, I'm kind of waiting for other things to happen. I'm kind of sitting in my hands and just being there as a consultant, and joining meetings, but not really actually doing anything because we're waiting for this or waiting for that. If you had an agency model, you could be off working on other projects and waiting for the team to come back instead of just sitting there as a researcher being like, okay, in 3 months, when this new prototype comes, I'll test it. But what do I do in the interim? I don't know. So, yeah, I mean, I see it. I think in a perfect world, in having a product person and a researcher and a designer and other kind of analytics / creative people like, data scientists, content people coming together on the same team is the goal. But I think that for that to happen, it goes back to kind of the maturity. I think that there has to be very clear definitions of how each role functions, and to have the other people know what that role is doing, and have that kind of built out, or have those norms in place, so that I, as a researcher, don't feel, uncomfortable going maybe against the grain a little bit, because I'm supposed to go against the grain. I'm supposed to come to the designers, or come to the product people and stakeholders, and kind of seek to impact the strategy and change the strategy based on my data. And a lot of times people don't want that, but they have to know that that's what you're doing.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. But do you think a hybrid model could exist? And if yes, what would that look like?
Tell me what you mean by hybrid.
I mean, the best of both, right? You take the best from the agency, best from the embedded, because there are pros and cons across.
There are. But I'm trying to even envision how you would set up how do you maintain that kind of autonomy, but also still, like you said, have the subject matter expertise of a given product. I mean, the other thing that I want to get your take on is, one of the things I said up front about what makes us UX people different than business people, because everybody can empathize. It's empiricism. It's having the data that comes in from the actual end users and translating that into strategic and design decisions, and trying to make those data points impactful. And it's big picture, non-product thinking, experience thinking.
Yeah.
And you're embedding a designer into a product, by definition, that's counter to what, if we're all agreeing that what we do as UX people, which is big picture experience thinking, independent of technology, even though there are others touch points, you're telling a UXer then to now narrow your focus. So how do you reconcile that?
Right. No, that's a good point. So let me try to answer that with another question. So do you think that the best way around it is to have specific individuals as part of your research and design team that think more strategic and think more big picture? who are then able to trickle that knowledge down to the guys who are more tactical, a little more focused, because maybe they're required to be super focused on one particular area.
I think it goes back to everybody, again, maturing the state of UX to the point where roles and responsibilities and functions are defined so that each function can kind of operate autonomously within a more cohesive whole. I think that is probably the future state, which is you have these autonomous individuals functioning as they should, but also those autonomous individuals knowing how the other functions are functioning. So, and it goes back to one of the things I was saying too, is that like part of the role of a researcher, for example, is to clash or to counter the power that designers have, or to counter the power that a decision maker stakeholder has, because you have this decision maker stakeholder who's representing the business, and they have their timelines, they have their incentives, they have their people that they have to please. They have their KPIs. But you as a researcher need to counter that with your data and representing the view of the end users. But you don't want to just set up this, and be adversarial just to be adversarial, because that could then ruin team dynamics. But if the team understands that's your role, that's what you're supposed to be doing, then it becomes a much more friendly environment for you to operate and actually do your job, instead of just trying to go along with the current, right? There's nothing worse in my mind than an embedded researcher. And I've seen this a lot, but it's hard because you kind of have to sometimes swim against the current.
Yeah.
To do that effectively when there's no norms in place on your team that, hey, this is a UX researcher. I'm going to kind of try to shuffle things up here a little bit. I'm going to try to take this design or this system that we're operating, and I'm going to try to pick out some of the pain points, and I'm going to try to pick out some of the flaws, but I'm going to try to do it as systematically and methodologically as I can, so that it's not just me versus you. It's this sample versus you. But ultimately, you want me to do that, and we want to build in lead time so that those those insights and those data points can kind of get consumed by the team, and enough of the time to actually add them to the backlog and get them developed out.
Yeah. No, so let me ask you this then. Do you think, and judging by kind of what you've been saying, do you think that teams, researchers and designers and content writers and everyone that kind of makes up this sort of research and design or innovation team, do you think there needs to be a component or an element of project management on a self-ownership level? And what I mean by that is not depending on the product owner to drive the experience, but sort of being the sole driver of, okay, we did the research, now we got to do this. Now we got to carve out some time, get the designers to work on, making the enhancements, and then find a way to put it back into the product backlog.
Yeah, I mean, there has to be I think a lot of times too, is when you can run into problems with flat teams that are too flat, whereas there is no leadership, or they're kind of each function is operating autonomously, yet how they come together, there's no conductor in the room telling the string section and the woodwind section to be to work, to making sure that they're working together and everyone's following the same sheet music. I mean, would you as a researcher want to take your kind of directive from a person who doesn't know very much about research?
No, I mean, so the way I kind of look at it is that, if I'm working as part of a research and design team, my understanding is that we are the team that owns the experience, right? We're the ones responsible for the end customer experience. I mean, if the let's say it's an app, if the app works well, if you're getting sales, If all that's good and dandy, that's great. But the moment you hear customer feedback that, oh, I didn't understand what was going on and that's why I dropped out of the journey, I don't see the blame. I don't think the blame should go back to the product owner. I think the blame goes back to the research and design team because they're the ones responsible for the experience. Chris, there was a point that he mentioned, I think maybe 20 something minutes ago, that just stayed in my head. And that was something along the lines of, that when we were on the topic of embedding designers in, you were talking about, you don't think that is a sustainable kind of approach unless there are certain norms or behaviors or practices put in place. In other words, team competencies.
Yeah, I think that the embedded model is not sustainable when you have people who are working together who don't really understand what the other ones are doing.
Yeah. So do you think that, having team competencies in place is a solution, right? If everybody understands what are the expected behaviors and how they can strive to live out those behaviors, maybe that's the way we get alignment.
That's a good start, I think. I mean, partly why I'm a kind of a believer in design thinking is because I think that it's a framework that can help bring teams together cross-functionally, because they're all, I call it collective intentionality. Everybody's looking at the same framework, so we kind of know where we are in the process, and we know when design can come in, and we know when design can kind of step back, and when research comes in, and designers and researchers know what each of them are doing and what their functions are, so it becomes simple, or more simple, and there's not this constant ambiguity about what to do next and what this person's up to and whose role is it. And I've been on teams like that, and it's a real struggle. I don't know if you've had experiences in this where you have a cross-functional team and nobody really knows what to do next. Nobody even knows where we're going.
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, it just happens so frequently that, the way I kind of look at it, right, and leaning into my own experiences as CDO for startup, and having to run the show entirely end to end and expected to know kind of what comes next. I just find myself just jumping in and trying to guide and take the ship forward one way or another until somebody else comes into the room and is able to figure out, okay, what do we do next?
Well, I mean, the analogy I sometimes think about, because I actually have a background in poli-sci, frameworks that kind of group together people and give them powers and responsibilities and functions is very similar. I think I see the analogy to political constitutions. So one of the most famous kind of political constitution is the U.S. Constitution, by the framers. And if you look at like James Madison and his ideas around separation of power, so you have a judicial system, you have a legislative system, you have an executive branch, and they all have their own function, and they all check each other's power. So you don't get too much power in the executive, you don't get too much power in the judicial, and they all kind of operate together and work together. And I think the same thing has to be the case for research and design and UX. Whereas the researchers, you don't want all the power being vested in just research and following what the research says. No, but you can't also have that for design. You can't just let design kind of go and have a designer just sit there creatively and come up with whatever they want. There has to be something that checks them. And
yeah, no, 100%. I think that's kind of where having these sort of QA sessions or QA checks and having a realignment session just to ensure that everyone's still on track, everyone's still aware of what the big picture is that we're trying to do here. And this kind of goes back to my original point that you can have someone embedded, but if you have these kind of alignment checks happening, like an agency does, that to me is a start to a perfect hybrid, right? where people can be super specific and super dive deep into the thick of things, but then at the same time know exactly what is the larger picture at play, right? Because we've got strategic folk as part of the research and design team that are mapping out this ecosystem and devising the experience strategy. You've got an orchestrator or a conductor kind of managing the flow of work coming in and out and ensuring that the right quality of requirements is shared across. You've got team competency set up so people know exactly how they should behave and what they should do and what's expected of them.
But I think also that this has to be kind of what you're saying is I agree with totally, and I think having that structure in place is so key. But I mean, do you think that it's do you agree with kind of my point, which is like what we need to do is we need to kind of vet this stuff and start talking about it and start getting principles and kind of standards in place, or does it have to happen on the fly for each project every time and context matters?
So yes and no. So let me tell you how the way I'm kind of looking at it. So yes to the standards and kind of framework, right? But I think, and we've kind of talked about this in this show and the last one, that research and design teams can exist in all sorts of different flavors and forms, right? Depending on the kind of industry and the kind of revenue model that you're working with.
What the behaviors are of the individual and what ecosystem they're in.
Exactly. And so kind of having a one size fits all for a style of a team wouldn't work. But if you have the fundamental frameworks and, there are certain things that can be universal and there are other things that have to be kind of tailored and specific, right? And you and I have kind of often described research as, it's not a one size fits all thing. It's like a tailored made suit, right? Depending on the need, we define the strategy.
It's not cookie cutter in any sense, right?
Exactly.
It's bespoke.
Exactly. And so I think the sort of operating model or the set of frameworks or competencies, essentially a team structure, I think kind of has to also work that way, but should have some shared consistencies, regardless of what kind of form it exists in, right?
I think the real hard part for getting a team structure standardized is you want something that is rigid to some degree that can't be changed, but you also need this structure or this framework to also be adaptable and flexible, because it has to change based on, the demand, the industry, all the different specifics.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head with that one.
So Mustafa, for the last maybe 20 or 30 minutes, we've been talking a lot about team structure, about the functions of a UX team, how the UX team can kind of interact in a cohesive way with the business, and kind of we've landed on this kind of interesting problem about universality versus specifics within a given project, within a given context. So were there any other topics that you wanted to kind of broach when it comes to a team?
So, I mean, if you were to ask me, how do I see a team ideally? So I guess I'll start with the basics, right? Obviously, you got your team of researchers doing, everything good that researchers do. You got your product designers who I would sort of describe as more experienced designers who are thinking of the experience itself, but also the visual aspect as well, right? How do I make this thing aesthetic? How do I get this to align to my brand, align to my design language system, and so on? You got service designers, right? Because in today's day and age, there is no individual product anymore, right? There is a full service where the product lives on top of.
It goes back to the point about if you want to think experience, you have to kind of sometimes think product or technology independent, and then just look at the different touch points within a given journey.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Right. So service designers, and then the unique one that I throw in there are content experience folks. Right. The guys focus on content, focus on how we communicate things across to customers. Right. Because in this day and age, I feel like, with the accessibility and consumer protection standards going up, um, being able to have clear, concise, and catchy and memorable content is what really uplifts an experience, right? Because the visual aspect will speak to you in one way, but the content will speak to you in a whole other way.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it depends also on the product or on your industry or on your focus. But there's going to also be experiences that are super content heavy, where you actually need some experts to handle that function. So
Yeah, and I mean industries where there's a bit of or a lack of understanding and education, right? Like we talk about financial literacy all the time when it comes to banking, and then that's a missing component. How can banks supplement or cater to that while serving the customer? So I guess maybe my industry is a bit of a bias when it comes to content, but that's kind of what I would throw in as my mighty four. And the last one that you kind of refer to as a UX product manager, I kind of see them more as sort of program leads, right? They are they could be one of the leads from whether it's research, design, or content, but instead be someone who's kind of more from a project management background, right? Who really understands agile and the way of working and being able to gather requirements and consolidate that into what would be the stream of services that the team takes on and delivers. So someone to kind of orchestrate that whole thing would be that program lead.
that this person kind of knows how to actually deliver on creating technology. Like they have that background, so that they can understand the different components and they can understand how to, bring certain areas together and when to back off and when to move, and when to kind of lean in and when to give somebody some time. They understand that, maybe a research project might take a month, and they can kind of think about how the different functions kind of work together. I mean, yeah, I mean, I like that. I like your breakdown a lot. I mean, I think adding service design makes a lot of sense to me, because I think especially starting projects, to understand what to focus on and how do we increase and how do we improve the experience, is the first step is to know what the current state is and start doing some maps. I think that's always a good, first step. And I think service design people are quite adept at knowing how to using research and kind of conducting research themselves to then build out a kind of a journey map or a service blueprint that can help get everybody on the same page, literally having a kind of source of truth, and then being able to narrow focus on specific areas where the team wants to work on. So that's totally get that and agree. I'm kind of curious because especially I know you have a background in engineering and CS. Do you see any value in having somebody on the team who has, whether it's hardware engineering or software engineering background, to be that kind of engineering consultant to make sure that the ideas that you're proposing are feasible?
Oh yeah, 100%. 100%. I mean, I find myself kind of being that fighter or that defender for certain concepts and ideas, because I'm able to justify it from a designer's lens and from a technology lens, right? So I personally do think that that's a plus. I mean, in the same way, if you've got someone who really understands a specific product, like again, going back to banking, a financial product, the ins and outs of that, because maybe they decided to take one course back in university and got a sound understanding on how that operates. That's a useful, powerful asset to have on the team, right? And the same could be applied, in any other industry. Like if you've worked in the medical space and really understand the nooks and crannies of the complexities, or the business side of things, you're able to actually ease your way through a lot of the potential friction you bump into if you were something who just was, fresh off the boat and walking into an industry for the first time. So I do think those kind of skill sets are incredibly valuable. I've personally benefited from it. But at the same time, it's always good to kind of have a mix of folks. You don't want an all-star design team who've only ever been, part of design projects, but never, and now being asked to step into a very technology-heavy kind of project. They're going to have a tough time, right? Unless they've got someone in-house to kind of mediate through it, or understanding stakeholders to kind of handhold them through it.
I sometimes feel, and maybe this is an insecurity of being a UX person and not being an engineer or designer, not an engineer, is going from the testing phase, the MVP phase, that this thing is still kind of a prototype, doesn't really have any roots to building that kind of leap. I almost wonder if, we're talking about maturity and how to move the field a little bit forward. I mean, is our superpower, is our value as designers to keep things in the realm of design, or is it going eventually to become the stuff that we actually want to take the concept and the ideas? Because I think when we're following, if you're following the design thinking principles, you're staying in the realm of conceptual ideas, and you're prototyping, and things can change really quickly, and you're trying to adapt it to a given environment, solve find certain problems, and then solve them kind of rapidly, which is super useful and helpful, and it's what we do kind of on a day-to-day basis. But taking that and making it real,
tangible, yeah. No, I think that's definitely something that can be explored, and right, that you explore the conceptual space, you evaluate, you test, you empathize, you do all those good things. But the ones that kind of have the superpower are either the designers who understand and can speak tech and align with business strategy, or the technologists who can align with business strategy and understand why design has been designed in a certain way and see it from the customer's lens, or even the business guy who understands the technical constraints, but also the shortcomings of the existing customer experience, which is why these new recommendations have been put forward.
We can find value in our work. I mean, like personally, is to see the work that we do, ultimately end up in something tangible and real. I think that can give the teams a lot of satisfaction, personally, professionally, et cetera, to see, your concept become something that's tangible. And to me, I feel like in the realm of design and UX, we really kind of lean into problem space and kind of staying kind of abstract. The way I kind of describe it is as in the realm of abstraction. Even though it's abstract, it can still be precise and non-ambiguous, but it's still abstract because it's not being built. And I just wonder if, always trying to think about it from a business point of view in terms of delivering value, is there value to just having these teams stay in the abstract? And it seems to me that eventually the answer is no. Eventually, we're going to want UX teams to, yes, lean into that problem space. Yes, lean into the solution space and keep the prototypes kind of lo-fi because of what you're saying, the amount of cost it takes to actually develop things out. But there has to be some sort of line to engineering always, because if we're not engineering these things and we're not moving the needle, then what are we doing?
Oh yeah, 100%. I think it goes back to the maturity and the buy-in on research and design. That in larger, mature organizations where design is a proven and tried and tested kind of business model to run, that's kind of where you can have the kind of design and research team that is more tactical and is able to deliver on product backlogs. And then another research and design team that kind of goes more on the abstraction and conceptual route of really exploring wide and far to see hypothetical ideas that may only see the light of day in the next 3 years.
And also, like, it kind of goes back to our embedded versus agency, or maybe agency is not the best way. Maybe there's agency, embedded, and then this third, which is more what I would call maybe innovation or innovative, or like blue sky, or, when you're literally separate. I've worked in a few places where we're literally separate from the business. I mean, we're attached to them. I'm working for the business, when I'm hired, that's the company that's paying me. But the team that I'm working on is separate, and we actually have engineers, and we're actually building stuff and then trying to find stakeholders during the process. But it's mostly really ideating and idea generating within the team, not from within, not from without. If you take an embedded model, right, where you add for example, a researcher, and they're doing research, and in a perfect world, that product is real, it's tangible, it's probably, there's something that exists, and they're seeking to make corrections and changes and adjustments. And your research, your testing goes into the product backlog, and it actually makes a difference. It actually makes an impact in the real world with real end users. So there's another kind of pro, I think, to some degree, and maybe why people want to push for it, because when you're connected to the business, the work that you do is being seen by them. It may not all be taken forward, right? But some of it might get in, and when it does get in, it will be implemented, because that's part of the business's job, is to make sure that these changes, this strategy. Now, if we're kind of just now in these teams, these pods, let's say, of service designers, pixel, let's call them pixel designers, researchers, kind of sprinting separate from business, and maybe getting some stakeholders or whatever involvement to kind of get projects going. Seeing it after is going to be a bit of a difficult process, which is why I think connecting to product teams is important, because it's actually tangible. But again, we kind of operate differently. If you want to look at big picture, it's not what product teams are doing. It's, you kind of have to take yourself away from the business, build out your strategy from a UX point of view, using your methods, using your tools. Okay, you're prototyping, but now you have something. But now after that, it becomes difficult, because who do you then attach it to? Who makes it real?
Yeah. I think that's a whole different conversation on, do you go with a stakeholder that's got a budget and got a vision, or do you go down the more exploratory route?
I think it comes actually down to how, not only just team structures, like individuals within a team, but how UX is structured in the organization.
Agreed.
And what role UX plays in a firm, right? Because that's never, in my experience, that's usually a little bit vague to really know. And a lot of it is us kind of it's why, you hear evangelizing and this kind of thing. A lot of it is bottom up, but maybe some of it needs to be top down. All right. Well, I think on that, I don't know. Do you have any other words, parting words, or parting ideas to talk through before we say goodbye?
No, I think we've kind of touched upon a lot of different aspects on this pretty broad topic of teams within UX and research and design. I think there's a lot to go on. I feel like we might end up having a follow-up episode with possibly a couple of guests on down the road. And then to the viewers listening in, if you've got any questions, any ideas, any thoughts, we'd love to hear your feedback. We'd love to hear your comments. Do drop them on the socials. We're on Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn as of now. Twitter to be coming up pretty soon. And yeah, let's start a conversation. Let's hear out what do you guys think about teams and the structure of teams within UX research and design.
Sounds good, Mustafa. All right. Talk to you soon. Over and out.
Awesome. Take care.
That's a wrap for this episode of UX. If you want to stay up to date with Chris and Mustafa's latest episodes, be sure to subscribe to the show and leave them a review on your favorite podcast platform. It helps other listeners find the podcasts and join in on the conversation. And don't forget to check the line notes to follow the podcast on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn for behind-the-scenes content, updates, access to comment boards, and sneak peeks of upcoming episodes. Thanks for listening to UX, and we'll see you next time for some more insights into the ever-evolving world of user experience.